27. Progress and Providence. The Enlightenment, while expressing great faith in reason, was unable to see the triumph of reason as very likely. Because of its strongly classical orientation, it shared the pagan's cyclical view of history. As Gay noted, the philosopher's quote, pictured civilization as individuals with a distinct life cycle ending in decay and death, end quote. In the 19th century, the idea of progress came into its own as a secular concept. Previously, it had been a Christian doctrine. With the merging of the evangelical and pietistic movements with the Enlightenment to produce secular, nationalistic and naturalistic views of progress, men began to see a predestined progress in history while rejecting both God and his predestination. Oliver Wendell Holmes again gives us a naive and confident expression of the new faith. Quote, did you ever read what Mr. Bancroft says about Calvin in his article on Jonathan Edwards, and mighty well said it is too in my judgments? Let me remind you of it. Whether you have read it or not, quote, setting himself up over against the privileged classes, he, with a loftier pride than theirs, revealed the power of a yet higher order of nobility, not of a registered ancestry of 15 generations, but one absolutely spotless in its escutcheon, preordained in the council chamber of eternity. End quote. I think you'll find I have got that sentence right, word for word, and there's a great deal more in it that many good folks who call themselves after the Reformer seem to be aware of. The Pope put his foot in the neck of kings, but Calvin and his cohort crushed the whole human race under their heels in the name of the Lord of Hosts. Now, you see, the point that people don't understand is the absolute and utter humility of science in opposition to this doctrinal self-sufficiency. I don't doubt this may sound a little paradoxical at first, but I think you will find it is all right. You remember the courtier and the monarch, Louis XIV, wasn't it? Never mind. Give the poor fellows that live by setting you right a chance. What o'clock is it? Says the king. Just whatever o'clock your majesty pleases, says the courtier. End quote. Holmes was a naive believer in hard facts. The world around him was made up of hard facts, which were a part of a grand law order governed by determined laws. Only fools disputed that reality. Quote, but there are people, and plenty of them today, who will dispute facts just as clear to those who have taken pains to learn what is known about them as that of the tides rising. They don't like to admit these facts because they throw doubts upon some of their cherished opinions. End quote. The quote-unquote facts Holmes referred to were the theoretical constructs of evolutionary geology, which represented a faith, not an observed and tested body of data. Moreover, Holmes assumed a predestination without God and the new elect people as scientists. With full assurance and arrogance, Holmes spoke of, quote, the absolute and utter humility of science, end quote. Holmes himself was a man of science. If what Holmes displayed was, quote, absolute and utter humility, end quote, perhaps we can call the attempts of scientists more recently to control men by brain implants and by denying freedom to all men save a group of scientists who will control mankind, a hint of developing pride. No kings or priests of old showed as much arrogance and aimed at so great a power over man as have modern scientists. A non-Christian scholar in surveying the modern world has noted that, quote, through the corruption of progress ideology brought on by the very attempt to live up to it, the pursuit of truth is replaced by the quest for power. Power is the chief goal of all progress-oriented societies. The reason for this lies deep in the structure of human nature. To understand the phenomenon of power, then, presupposes an inquiry into the foundations of human nature. Social scientists, qua scientists, are ambivalent as to whether there is any such thing as human nature at all. In this book, I assume there is. End quote. Rubinoff thus reflects a biblical recognition that man's nature, in its fallen estate, aims at power, to be as God. The problem thus is that man corrupts what he aims at by his lust for power. As Rubinoff introduces his problem, quote, I am concerned with two central ideas, progress and power, both of which have had a deep and profound influence on the course of Western history. With the idea of progress came the idea of identifying value with pragmatic and hedonistic goals, goals which can be pursued only through the exercise of power. The hedonistic dimensions of the pursuit of power are what make this phenomenon such a potentially dangerous one, but it is dangerous for still another reason. Progress posits a belief in transcendental goals which both direct and supply the sense of history. But the irony is that the ideology of progress surreptitiously conspires to introduce the very opposite belief, namely the relativistic notion that truth is whatever happens to satisfy the needs of the moment. And wherever these needs conflict, power is again invoked as the sole arbiter. End quote. Rubinoff has seen the problem clearly, but at no time does he consider the biblical answer. Instead, he seeks a pseudo-transcendence through evil imagination. Quote, I am therefore concerned in this book with the self-destructive potential of power as it affects man's primordial tendency to evil and with man's inherent capacity to transcend himself through the creative use of the imagination. The main thesis of this book is that the most effective antidote for the performance of evil is the imagination of evil, and that the most viable therapy for the pathological abuse of power is accordingly an imaginative critique of power. End quote. By becoming pathological, we will supposedly regain health and exercise our, quote, primordial tendency to evil. For Rubinoff, quote, man is himself the source of the evil against which he is constantly struggling. End quote. This evil is inherited from man's animal past. For the way of transcendence, Rubinoff looks to Nietzsche, Jean Genet, and Norman Mailer. Quote, what is lacking in our world is not violence, terror, and death, but creativity and life. Thus, Mailer concludes, if one is to make one's way back to life and restore creativity to the world, the violence and irrationality from which we now flee must somehow be passed through and digested instead. In short, says Mailer, the way to transcend violence is to commit it, to get it out of your system once and for all. The decision is, quote, to encourage the psychopath in oneself, end quote. But how does one commit violence? Not in fact, for to commit it in fact is to surrender to it. To enter it through the imagination, however, is to transcend it. The existential moment is therapeutic precisely because it is imaginative. End quote. This is the Gnostic principle that man as divine can give body to aspects of his being and expel them from his own being. The poet William Blake was an advocate of this principle in milder form. Just as God created all things by his sovereign act, so man supposedly by his imagination creates all the possibilities of his inner world and then chooses to abolish some possibilities which he has now supposedly transcended. The salvation of our age, then, lies in nothing less than the speed with which the imaginative celebration of evil can supersede the pornographic enjoyment of evil through the exercise of power. End quote. Did this work for Mailer, or did not the act follow his imagination where his wife was concerned? And did not the imagined evils of the 19th century lead to the enacted evils of the 20th century? But to present Rubinoff as clearly as possible, let us see more fully the alternatives as he presents them. Quote, faced with such possibilities to be expected whenever the nature of man is violated by an excessively rationalized humanism, realists like Grand Inquisitor and B.F. Skinner have argued that the only solution to the paradox of the human condition is to bring mankind under a benevolent dictatorship which will satisfy his need for security and authority while preserving the illusion of freedom, while Freud, on the other hand, favours a more open society which controls aggression by sublimating it into productive and creative activities. Looked at in this way, the institution of a scientifically ordered system of social control, whether of the Skinnerian or Freudian variety, or else the institution of a religion of authority, as favoured by the Grand Inquisitor, does indeed seem far preferable to the risk of annihilation through the pornographic pursuit of evil. But, in fact, these are not our only options. It is almost certain that by pretending to be angels, we shall surely become devils. At the same time, however, no real victory is achieved by so arranging conditions that men are no longer permitted to pursue evil. Denying to men both the rights and the opportunity to be evil is as much a negation of their humanity as pretending they are thoroughly virtuous. The possibility of real virtue exists only for man who has the freedom to choose evil. It is only for the man who has first, quote, lived through, end quote, imaginatively or otherwise, the choice of evil, that the real meaning of virtue is disclosed for the first time. But the first stage in the dialectic of human redemption through the imaginative encounter with evil is learning to refuse all illusions, whether it be the illusion of man as an angel led astray by wicked forces from afar, or the illusion of man wholly driven by demonic forces from within. Man exists at the centre of a contradiction which can be resolved only by, quote, living through, end quote, in imagination and understanding all of his intrinsic possibilities. It is only, to repeat, through the imaginative transcendence of evil that the future of mankind can be secured. End quote. Rubinoff sees a, quote, rationalized humanism, end quote, as responsible for our plight. By its view of man as naturally good, it has given man room and freedom to be freely evil. As one of the critics of, quote, rational humanism, end quote, he says, quote, for God's sake, let us stop pretending that we're angels or we shall surely become devils, end quote. At times, Rubinoff seems to say, let us pretend to be devils by giving full expression to our evil imagination so that we could become angels, or at least good men. Virtue, he holds, is only possible if man is free to choose evil. We can agree that responsibility is basic to man's freedom, but his freedom is the freedom of a creature, not of a god, a secondary, not a primary freedom. Rubinoff never sees God's law as the test of man's freedom. For him, man's freedom is primary, and it must therefore be totally uninhibited in its exploration of evil. His position is that it is necessary that we sin, quote, imaginatively or otherwise, end quote, so that even the act is admissible for Rubinoff, in order to have the freedom to be good by exorcising evil from our nature. We cast out the evil, but where? In commenting on Genet, Rubinoff writes, quote, Sartre makes the point that Genet's writings are therapeutic. By infecting us with its evil, Genet delivers himself from it. Each of his books is a cathartic act of possession, a psychodrama. With each work, he masters increasingly the demon that possesses him. And so, says Sartre, his years of literature are equivalent to a psychoanalytic cure, end quote. But what are the consequences of Genet's, quote, infecting, end quote, his many readers? And where is there any evidence that Genet has delivered himself from his evil? Has he not rather indulged freely because his indulgence has gained respectability among existentialists? Is it not more accurate to say that Genet has remained evil and has infected others with his evil? Where in all of this has Rubinoff found any transcendence? Do we get rid of hatred by indulging hatred? And do we transcend ourselves by indulging ourselves? If Rubinoff is right, the way to transcend love is to love. Rubinoff wants progress, but what is progress? Clark, in analysing the contemporary meaning of progress, sees it as, quote, the denial of providence, end quote. It is closely linked to evolutionary ideas, is held to be natural and inevitable, to be a natural law and to be beyond the ability of man to block. A common modern proverb has been, you can't stop progress. Beard held that while, quote, progress, end quote, is an idea and not a natural law, the rise of scientific technology ensures progress because, quote, technology, by its intrinsic nature, transcends all social forms, the whole heritage of acquired institutions and habits. It cannot be monopolized by any nation, class, period, government, or people. In Catholicity, it surpasses all religions, end quote. It is thus, quote, significant for the idea of progress, end quote. But even as Beard wrote, Stalin was busy in Russia using technology to create a new barbarism, and Hitler was soon to do the same. Others later followed suit. Since Beard's day, many secular scholars, as witness Gunther Stent's The Coming of the Golden Age, A View of the End of Progress, 1969, have surrendered all belief in progress because man without God is also man without either meaning or hope. Bury defined the non-Christian view of progress thus, quote, this idea means that civilization has moved, is moving, and will move in a desirable direction. But in order to judge that we are moving in a desirable direction, we should have to know precisely what the destination is. To the minds of most people, the desirable outcome of human development would be a condition of society in which all the inhabitants of the planet would enjoy a perfectly happy existence. But it is impossible to be sure that civilization is moving in the right direction to realize this aim. End quote. It is also impossible, without a transcendental standard, to judge what happiness or progress is. The idea of progress is simply the doctrine of providence divorced from God. The first three articles of the Westminster Confessions, Chapter 5, quote, of Providence, end quote, give us a summary statement of the doctrine. Quote, 1. God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose and govern all creatures, actions and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness and mercy. 2. Although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he ordereth them to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. 3. God, in his ordinary providence, maketh use of means, yet is free to work without, above, and against them, at his pleasure. End quote. The Shorter Catechism states the matter even more succinctly. Quote, Question 2. What are God's works of providence? Answer. God's works of providence are his most holy, wise, and powerful preserving and governing all his creatures and all their actions. End quote. St. Paul in Romans 8:28 gives a magnificent statement of the doctrine of providence. Quote, And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. End quote. There is a meaning, progress, and salvation only because God is, and because his providence absolutely and totally encompasses and governs all things. In a universe ruled by God, the future is assured. Every fact is a God-created fact and moves to a God-ordained purpose. Nothing is futile, nor by chance. In a universe ruled by chance, victory is only an accident, and meaning an illusion. Matthew Arnold expressed this aspect of the loss of faith in his writings, as witness these lines, quote, And though thou thinkest that thou knowest sure thy victory, yet thou canst not surely know, for we are all like swimmers in the sea, poised on the top of a huge wave of fate, which hangs uncertain to which side to fall, and whether it will heave us up to land, or whether it shall roll us out to sea, back out to sea to the deep waves of death, we know not, and no search will make us to know. Only the event will teach us in its hour. End quote. Arnold's point was not that the future is unknown to us, but that it is governed by a blind and meaningless fate. Life for him, as he wrote in, quote, Dover Beach, end quote, quote, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude nor peace, nor help for pain, end quote. In The Scholar Gypsy, Arnold saw what the loss of faith was doing to scholars like himself. Their faith being gone, their, quote, intellectual throne, end quote, was unproductive, save of frustration and misery, quote. And we, light half-believers of our casual creeds, who never deeply felt nor clearly willed, whose insight never has borne fruit in deeds, whose vague resolves never have been fulfilled, for whom each year we see breeds new beginnings, disappointments new, who hesitate and falter life away, and lose tomorrow the ground won today. End quote. We, these faithless scholars, Arnold recognized, learn only disillusionment. Wisdom comes to be disillusionment, hopelessness and despair. What Arnold saw very early, Gunther Stent documented a century later. Progress as a faith failed because it was divorced from God's providence. The great secular dream of natural and inevitable salvation gave way to cynicism and the return of the old pagan belief in a cyclical view of history, of a meaningless and endless return to nothingness and death. With the decline and collapse of the idea of progress, reason also went into eclipse. An irrational universe and a meaningless life cannot long sustain a belief in the validity of reason. Moreover, as man lost faith in reason because of their growing belief in the ultimacy of chance and meaninglessness, their belief in occultism arose. Men do not readily live with a lack of meaning. They find it easier to believe that the universe is essentially demonic than that it is barren of meaning. If they deny God, they will soon affirm the devil.